Now, I'm shifting gears a little bit to a responsibility that I have to introduce our keynote speaker. So there's a lot that I could say about of environmental ethics and philosophy at Oregon State University, which seems to be home for great, vivid photographs. He's also the first ever non-scientist / philosopher to lead one of the prestigious long-term ecological research stations in our nation. But what I want to actually share with you in this introduction is how I came to know Michael Nelson. A couple of years ago, I was having a conversation with an editor at The American Scientist, and I asked this editor if she would send me her 3 favorite papers with whatever criteria favorite would evoke, papers that she had recently edited so that I could read those papers. The first paper that she sent me was written by Michael Paul Nelson. And I read that paper, which was on environmental ethics. And I read that paper again, and I read it again. And then I went to his website and I found that there were dozens and dozens and dozens of more papers on his website. And I started reading them. And then I started picking up books that this man has written with collaborators. The things that he would write and the words that he would share, things like this. We call people to take themselves seriously as moral agents, to reclaim the right to live the lives they believe in, to live as people of integrity, conscientious, compassionate, joyous, and to take away the ability of the powerful to destroy the earth. Those are the kinds of words that Michael Nelson holds inside of him. I soon reached out to him when we knew that the theme for this year's workshop was going to focus on ethical action for disaster risk reduction. And I asked him if he would do us the honor of joining us this year as our keynote speaker. And one of the things that we quickly realized is that while Michael doesn't necessarily work squarely in the hazards and disaster field, that we share many common concerns and questions. And I also learned very quickly that Michael is a person of great kindness, of great humor, and great curiosity. That he asked me so many questions about all of you and what it is that you do and what it is that you care about, questions that our community is grappling with so that he could prepare to be with us today. And so I hope you will all join me in offering a tremendous round of applause and an offer of gratitude to Michael for kicking off this year's 48th Annual Natural Hazards Workshop. Thank you.
That was sweet. Thank you. Where's my clicker? Somebody teach me how I change my slides. Yeah. Okay. Oh, it's that simple. Well, thanks. I'm super honored to be among you, to be asked to give this talk and to be able to give this talk and to share and celebrate the really amazing work that you all do and to try to bridge some of the gaps between your work in world and natural hazards and my own in conservation and natural resource ethics. And to be honest, in preparation for this talk, I started to realize that maybe sometimes in some ways our worlds are actually not that far apart. Climate change, massive wildfires. So this is only my cover because knew you'd be, but I still had to, so I'm going to open the story. And this is a story that I think it would number the things that I really want to say. So more than a decade ago, my fierce colleague, Kathleen Dean Moore, she and I gathered a group of philosophy PhDs, arguably the smartest people that we knew. Certainly with the most highly credentialed brains that we knew. And we wanted them to think hard about the world, why the world was so unable to make progress on climate mitigation and how we could get unstuck. And what role philosophy knew the consequences of failure, and everybody seemed absolutely incapable of action, of getting started. Even people most concerned at that time didn't say the C words. Remember when we didn't say climate change? As if they were banished from polite conversation. Yeah, thanks, sure. So we met at the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest, Horace James, I think, just to not have an acronym in there. So this is an ancient forest in the Oregon Cascades, towering hemlock trees, Douglas firs. Some of these trees are 500, some 700 years old. Shafts of light lit the deep moss. This is truly a holy place. And if there was ever any place to remind us of our inescapable obligations to the deep past of the planet and to the future of its beings, this was the place. So we gathered in a circle, and you know what? Those philosophers started to dink around. The forest appears to be green, but is it really green? Or is it only our perception of green? And how would we know? They weren't even looking at the forest when they were saying things like that. This was such a disappointment. So after many deep breaths, Kathy and I took ourselves off into a corner that evening, and we really pushed each other. What do philosophers know how to do? What can we contribute? Surely something new was needed. Now it's going to catch up with like 5 slides. There we go. We saw that the work to correct our societal course, especially around climate change, which threatens to destroy the fabric of our world, was going nowhere at that time. Our climate science colleagues were finding consensus around the dramatic and dangerous scientific findings. They were communicating that consensus, and yet nothing. So they redoubled their efforts. They spoke with one voice. They tweeted and Facebooked like nobody's business, and still nothing. And the rest of us were acting as if this destruction of the fabric of our world was perfectly normal, and that we would never, in no way in the future, suffer as a result of this robbing of our essential underpinning. Our science colleagues were warning us, however, that this was not true, that the world beneath us was going to suffer a structural collapse, and that we would not escape that collapse. So as philosophers, we saw what we thought was a missing piece, the moral affirmation that the hoped for results of anthropogenic climate change, namely action to mitigate it, could not be derived from the facts alone. That yes, certainly climate change was a scientific issue, but fundamentally it was a moral issue, and that part of the conversation about morality, ethics was missing from climate change. We weren't seeing it as a moral issue, and that was having disastrous implications. So the practical disconnect between the facts of the matter and the call to action was really the result, we realized, of incomplete logic. This is where I break into the philosophy professor part, but just for a second, I can't help it. It's in my contract. So what we realized was that we were missing the second premise of what we call the practical syllogism. A syllogism is just an argument with 2 premises that leads to a conclusion. The practical syllogism is a syllogism that has prescription for action, oughts and shoulds as the consequence. And we realized that we were trying to go from P1, these are the facts of the matter. This is what climate change is doing. This is what the future will look like, to actions all by themselves. And it doesn't matter how many facts you can string together, no ought, no prescription for action follows from that list of facts alone. We needed to fill in that second premise somehow. So what we did is we wrote to 100 of the world's moral leaders, and we asked them, do you believe it's wrong to wreck the world? And can you explain that in about 1,500 words? And so what we did then is we toured and we promoted that book as hard as we could in auditoriums, on college campuses, at nature centers, and even at a former monastery that looked an amazing like Hogwarts, and was absolutely haunted and had no locks on the doors. So at the time we published Moral Ground, Ethical Action for a Planet in Peril, most people were thinking of climate chaos as a technological problem, a scientific problem, a national security problem, an economic nightmare, an existential challenge. Scientists were treating it as if it was an education problem. If people only knew, if they only knew what was happening and going to happen, they would act. But few people were framing it as an ethical problem that required an ethical response. So our goal was to change that. Our motivation was the conviction that a sense of moral responsibility moves people to action in powerful ways that another impetus for action might not. Our logic was that a moral affirmation, it's wrong to wreck the world, would take us from the facts of climate change. If we don't act, climate change will wreck the world, to the conclusion, therefore we must act. So since that book was published in 2010, we have seen a surge in moral arguments around climate change that really has become a flood in the past few years when people went to the streets and the courts and filled them making arguments about justice and human rights. We claim no credit for this. Maybe Pope Francis read Moral Ground because the Vatican made us give them 6 copies of it. But since, I don't know why, but since the book was published, that has really changed quite a bit. Announcing that the Rockefeller Brothers Fund was divesting, of all things, from fossil fuels, Valerie Rockefeller Wayne affirmed that there's a moral imperative to preserve a healthy planet. And then we have Greta Thunberg speaking in ferocious moral terms to the leaders of the fossil fuel corporations. I hope you did not know how much harm you were causing, because if you knew and you didn't stop, I would have to call you evil. And Naomi Klein acknowledging the power of moral arguments. There's nothing more powerful than a values-based argument, she says. We're not going to win this as bean counters. We're going to win this because this is an issue of values, human rights, and right and wrong. What actually moves people's hearts are the arguments based on the value of life. So what does it mean to include ethics and ethical appeals in our repertoire, whether that be in conservation, climate change, or natural hazards work? Well, first, ethics, of course, is a topic. It's a word, it's a discipline, and it carries a little bit of baggage in public discourse, I think. So most fundamentally, ethics, a little bit more philosophy professor here, sorry. Most fundamentally, ethics is a subdiscipline of philosophy. Philosophers tend to divide philosophy into 3 big categories: epistemology, or theories of knowledge; metaphysics, or theories about reality; and then ethics, ideas about values and prescriptions for actions and oughts and shoulds. And then there are other areas that may or may not fit into those categories. Believe it or not, philosophers argue about this. So one way to think about this is just to think about the questions that various disciplines and subdisciplines ask. And I'm thinking here specifically about streams, because I spend a lot of time with stream ecologists. So biophysical science question about streams would be something like this: how does variation in stream temperature in a given system influence primary productivity? A social scientific question about streams might be something like, how does a given public perceive or value streams in a given system? And an ethical set of questions might be, how ought we to value streams, whether that be in general or in a specific system? Should we attribute direct moral standing to streams, the rights of nature that we are hearing about a lot now? Should we allow the diversion of stream water in a given system for recreational purposes? It's another way to see this distinction. So that's a little bit about what ethics is, a very little bit. But maybe we should also talk a little bit about what some of the things that ethics is not, just to get some of these things out of the way. Ethics is not really about telling other people what to do. This is probably more akin to certain forms of parenting or political or religious leadership. That's not really what ethicists are interested in. It's about examining and articulating clearly what is of value and the relationship of that value to the situation in the world, and imagining how we might, in light of that relationship, act, how we might go about our business. And fundamentally, ethics begins with each of us. The most important subject of ethical discourse and reflection is, in fact, ourselves. Institutional review boards, association codes of conduct, and even laws are not a substitute for critical ethical self-reflection. And in fact, I would suggest that it's somewhat dangerous to relegate our ethical autonomy and self-reflection to others. So that's one thing that ethics is not. Please ignore all the words. That's just really supposed to be an image. Ethics are also not just merely a set of subjective utterances. Ethics can be rigorous and action-oriented. Consider the perennial question about whether or not scientists should be advocates. We've been wrestling with this question for decades now. You could take that question and you could think about, well, why should they and why shouldn't they? And you could lay out arguments. This is just a couple of examples of where you would systematically lay out an argument. The first argument is about, the conclusion is our scientists should not be advocates because of concerns about credibility. And the second argument is suggest that they should be advocates because they live in a democracy and have an obligation to be citizens. So the point here is that you can actually deal with ethical utterances in a very systematic and rigorous way. Ethics has far more to do with logic than is typically appreciated. Scholarly ethics is largely concerned with using argument analysis to formally assess these propositions that end with we ought to or we ought not to, in the same way that science goes about its business, and there's the historical reason for that. Another way to think about what ethics is that it's about motivations and the purpose of our work. It's about the ways to explain why it is that we do what we do. And there are often many reasons for why we do what we do. And I would suggest that rather than shying away from ethical discourse, what I think we need to do is have a more robust ethical conversation, one that actually mirrors the ethical universe around us, an ethical universe that I think at times we sell short. The moral space available to us is far greater than we realize and take advantage of. Even in standard Western ethical approaches, there's more diversity to ethical motivations than we realize. Ethical Western ethic discourse tends to really focus on consequences. We make decisions about whether or not this was the right policy or action on the basis of the consequences. So we're very consequentially oriented in the West. In fact, some people think that this kind of cost-benefit analysis is in fact all there is to ethics. But even in the Western tradition, there's far more available to us as well. Sometimes we think about adhering to external authorities like naturalness, natural law theory, or the command of a divinity or some divine book. Sometimes we talk about rights theory, which don't necessarily have anything to do with consequences. And in our deep past, we used to be interested in character, in virtues, in care, humility, those kind of standard virtues. So even within Western ethical discourse, there's a lot available to us. So one big challenge in conservation is whether and in what way we might coexist with wildlife. So I'm going to sort of draw upon my experience and ask you to think about how some of these ethical concepts may or may not apply to the work that you do. So we're really interested in coexistence with wildlife in conservation. As people have become more willing to consider wildlife as morally relevant, this presents us with a moral challenge that we might not have seen before. What do we do when interests between humans and wildlife conflict? So this is new moral territory for us. The answer used to be very clear. Maybe we could consider the question to be actually one of sharing, the ethics of sharing. This is basic stuff in a way. Our parents taught us to share. We share our toys with our siblings, we share our time with our grandparents. And who do we share with? Well, we share with anyone we can. And most certainly we share with those in need. And while it might be the case that in certain extreme circumstances, we rescind the ethic of sharing, this is something that we grow up. Can we make sense in this realm of the coexistence? Sharing as a foundation for the coexistence with wildlife, sharing the world's resources, sharing the world's spaces, sharing our admiration even. An entire wildlife coexistence strategy could be formed around the ethics of sharing. I'm borrowing here from my colleague and friend, Robin Wall-Kimmerer. Many of you have probably read Braiding Sweetgrass, her now legendary book. All state wildlife agencies are charged with setting wildlife hunting targets. Consider the thinking that goes into how it is that we set a wildlife hunting target. What if we thought about setting wildlife hunting targets not on the agricultural model of maximum take without infringing on overall population, which is how we tend to think of it, but instead, what if we thought of it as a matter of reciprocity, that central indigenous value? Wildlife provide us with a gift, and in exchange for that gift, we are called to engage, in Robin's words, in an honorable harvest, which may be quite different than maximum sustained yield. We're called to be honorable actors in a gift exchange. In an honorable harvest, what do? We ask permission, and we learn to listen to an answer. We take only what we need. We use all that we take. We minimize harm. We take only what is given. We share the gift that is given. We are grateful and we reciprocate. We find ways to reciprocate that gift, all in exchange for nothing less than life. I want you to notice too how moral reframing impacts the questions that we might ask, and therefore the answers that might be available to us. So where I live and work in the Pacific Northwest, we think a lot about old growth forests or ancient forests. People who are skeptical of the value of ancient forests or who think only in these consequentialist terms, they like to ask this question: how much ancient forest is enough? But if we're called to an honorable harvest to act as honorable actors, then that question might not be appropriate. Instead, the question might be, well, how much land serving only narrow human ends is enough? How much greed is enough? And maybe we don't even really have to get very fancy with our moral arguments. I mean, just consider human survival. Human survival is worth caring about, as you know. Certainly the wrongness of not acting to avert such harms is a violation of our commitment to ourselves and to our kind. In a world on its current trajectory, honoring our commitment to human survival requires action. Gus Speth is the former dean of the Yale School of Forestry, and he puts it this way: all we have to do to destroy the planet's climate and ecosystems and leave a ruined world to our children and grandchildren, all we have to do is to keep doing exactly what we are doing today. And that's a moral wrong, so we must act. While it might not be that controversial to make an argument about human survival, it's good to remind ourselves that we too have value and that this commitment to self-preservation requires action on our part. And my final example is integrity, the notion of integrity. So when people are asked, and as we toured with Moral Ground, we would do this exercise with audiences, when we ask them to rate their hope that humankind will find a way to maintain a livable climate, and we ask them to rate their hope on a scale of 1, which means not a snowball's chance in hell, to 10, nothing to worry about here, they generally come in at about 3 to 4 on the hopeometer. It's a very specific scale. And they speak kind of wistfully when they explain why they come out sort of low. They say things like, let's face it, our options are limited. Our cities and homes and transportation systems are disgracefully designed. Destructive ways of living and are skillfully protected by people in positions of profit and power around the world. Extractive corporations are behaving like sociopaths, they say, and we've run out of time. How can any reasonable person be hopeful? And then they say, if you don't have hope, what do you have? And they fill in despair. But that's a false and dangerous and disempowering dichotomy. There is, in fact, another motivation: integrity. Think integer, wholeness, a matching between what we know and what we value and what we do. This is walking the talk. This is to act justly because you believe in justice, not because you believe in the consequences of justice. This is to live gratefully because life is a gift, to act lovingly toward the earth because you love it. The meaning of our lives is not what we accomplish in the end any more than the meaning of a baseball game is the last out. What makes our lives meaningful is the actions and the activities that we engage in that embody our values, whatever happens in the world. And these are just a couple of examples, but there's so much more ethical ground to appeal to. So do we have an obligation to find ways not to wreck the world or even reimagine the world? Yes, we could answer in many ways: for the survival of humankind, because compassion requires it, because justice demands it, because the world is beautiful, to honor our duties of gratitude and respect, for the stewardship of God's creation, to keep our promises to the children, to honor our duties to future generations, because our moral integrity requires us to do what is right, or because we love the world. But here's what I really want to say to you: don't sell ethical appeals short. And by that, I mean two things. First of all, don't underestimate the power of ethical arguments. The greatest changes in our culture, arguably, the abolition of slavery, the civil rights movement, had at their core ethical beliefs about what is a proper way to treat other human beings and what is not. And secondly, don't hold back from learning how to use ethical reasoning and then using it. Like any tool, ethics can be wielded clumsily or adeptly, and sometimes even beautifully. In general, clumsy moral arguments often look like scolds or assertions without nuance, sometimes without actual arguments. Elegant moral arguments often look like invitations to consider, or maybe even confessions. They ask questions to pull the reader or the listener in. I think we need everything. I think we need all approaches. The challenges that we face, arguably the greatest challenges in the history of humanity, require the full power and force of the human imagination. And that is captured in our various disciplines and cultures and other variations. We divide, we bifurcate, we relegate at our own peril. This point about the necessity of all hands, I think, is made beautifully by my friend Robin Kimmer, once again, who writes about her culture's tradition of a giveaway. And this is where a person who is celebrating a life event gives gifts to the community members. She says, reciprocity calls us to honor our responsibilities for all that we have been given, for all that we have taken. Let us hold a giveaway. Spread our blankets out and pile them high with gifts of our own making. Imagine the books, the paintings, the poems, the clever machines, the compassionate act, the transcendent idea, the perfect tool, gifts of mind, hand, heart, voice, and vision. Whatever our gift, we're called to give it in return for the privilege of breath. So I do this work because I believe that the world is beautiful and that beauty should remain, because I have an obligation to be a good ancestor, which means to protect the possibility of flourishing in the future for the 7th generation. I do this work because I love the world. I see this world in my life as an undeserved gift, and I have an obligation to reciprocate that gift. Those are just some of my own moral obligations. Likely you share some of them, of course you do. So many days, even most days, it really does feel like the end of the world. And I think that's especially true for those of us who face the immediate and often violent results of our culture's longstanding and dysfunctional relationship with the world. And I would never in a million years want to make light of the misery endured by those who suffer most immediately and unfairly as a result of that relationship. But maybe, just maybe, this ending of the world could also be the start of another, a new world, a world worth wanting. And that world could begin right here. The writer and thinker Arundhati Roy, in reference to our pandemic, puts it this way. She says, historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice, hatred, and avarice, our dead bodies, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us, or we can walk through it lightly, with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. In the words of indigenous philosopher Kyle Powers-White, as it is, this world is our ancestors' dystopia, our ancestors' worst nightmare. In so many ways, it's not a world that's worth saving, but it's certainly a world that's worth reimagining. I think many of us believe that the dominant Western worldview, the centuries-long experiment that has been superimposed upon the world, is a failure of staggering and heartbreaking proportions. For many of us, that's why we're here, to find a better way. Perhaps it's time to seek the world's forgiveness, taking heart in the earth's ability to heal, those new beginnings that come each year with the seasons, the tides that turn, always turn when they reach the lowest ebb, and the human proclivity to think of a better way. I think we know in our bones that our current approaches are broken. It's time to ask all people of conscience and imagination to join us in the search for better understanding of the relationship of humans to the world and to one another, to call for humility to replace hubris, for service to the earth to replace service to the economy, for an ethic of care and reciprocity to replace one of callous rapaciousness, and for acts of love to replace those born of selfishness and arrogance. Like so many of elements of our world, the end and reimagining of the world, it requires new ways of thinking. I'm always looking for new ways of thinking about something, new metaphors even to guide us. And I think this includes ethics. So finally, I'll leave you with this. I'm obsessed with a poet from Ohio right now, and his name is Jared Anderson. Look up crypto naturalist on Twitter. He's really quite amazing. He gives us a plant-based way to think about navigating the world, and it's captured in the plant Forsythia. And he writes this: as Forsythia grows tall, its branches bend beneath their own weight, bowing to the ground in arches of yellow flowers. Wherever they touch the earth, the branches root again and send up new shoots, stitching gold across the landscape. Some new kinds of knowledge shift our center of gravity, staggering us, bending us low beneath the burden. If you think of your worldview as a stone tower, this shift is a cataclysm of splintered rock. If your worldview is Forsythia, then every startling truth that bends you low becomes a new connection to the earth, a new way to stand, an invitation to grow. We live in a time of strong wind and sudden pressure. It is not an age for towers. It's an age for stubborn flowers. Thank you. We have 10 minutes, evidently, and I'm happy to take questions. And Kendra's down for a nap. Okay. Can't see him.
So we have a microphone coming on the room. If anyone has any questions, would you please raise your hand and we will get a mic. I see a hand right there. Could we bring a mic over here, please? Thank you. And Musaber, thanks for getting the mic and then helping us to see the other hands.
Thank you for your talk. Have you thought of, in addition to morals, the role of the imagination, which I think you're alluding to with the poetry? And I think of William Blake and Coleridge, and how they were facing this kind of scientific worldview and trying to find a look at what was being lost and how to make that bridge. They sort of looked at an alternative, I think.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about creativity and imagination lately. So one of my most recent collaborations is actually with artists and designers who are creatives. And I've been thinking about my own students and my role, my goal with them is ultimately to create intellectual creatives, people who can ask different questions, think different thoughts. It's very easy in our disciplines to kind of get rooted into a certain way of doing things, a certain form of question. I've also been changing some of my classes. So I teach critical thinking, but I don't call it that anymore. I call it critical and creative thinking. And I teach it in studio form, like designers do. So there's these big blocks of time. I think about my course in environmental ethics. I jam the word imagination in there. I think sometimes the way that imagination, in my experience, comes out kind of profoundly is when we really start to interact with people from different backgrounds, whether that be disciplinary backgrounds or cultural backgrounds. We start to see things in a different way. Perhaps the most important component for good imagination is also empathy, which is a trainable quality. So empathy, imagination, and creativity, I think are critical. I don't think we reimagine the world without imagination. That seems kind of obvious. So yeah, thanks for highlighting that.
Hello? Over here?
Oh, yeah. Hi. Show you where the light is.
Stand up. Okay, I'm standing up. Hi, thank you very much for this, because I think a lot of us in our work and our daily lives do not take the time to think. And by think, I mean reflect on what does it all mean? Why are we doing this? Is this a good career? What are the outcomes? Where will I be 20 years from now? But I'm an anthropologist, and in our worldview, there's a word that's been generated called the Anthropocene, which has to do with the age of people. But I think it also implies a settling, Anthropocene settling. Oh, it's just the way it is because we're people and this is what we do. And so instead of, the settling, I would propose we have to use your idea of beyond the reimagining. And the reimagining I would propose is thinking about the ethics of the ecocene rather than the Anthropocene. This comes out of the work I've done in Alaska with the Valdez oil spill, where I reimagined a community of nature and culture connected together. That culture nature link defined these people and made them what they were and how they ran their lives and related to nature. And what happened with the spill is this: it was broken, and the consequences were like a compression of everything bad about the Anthropocene, and they continue in that way. So anyway, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's Anthropocene reminds me of that era not that long ago where all of us brushed off our old grant proposals and our old talks and we just jammed the word sustainability on them. And then a couple of years ago, we just jammed the word in the Anthropocene on it, right? Every conference had in the Anthropocene. And I kind of have mixed reactions to it. On the one hand, I kind of appreciate the honesty of it, that we have this dominant feature, but I have the same concern that you do, that does that therefore justify the actions. My colleague Kathleen Dean Moore says if we really want to call it what it is and name it after humans, we should call it the obscene. So I do like thinking about, well, what comes next? What comes after this? Or grabbing a hold of that concept and defining it in the way that you're suggesting. Okay, we'll call it the Anthropocene, but like, let's talk about what that actually means. Let's create an ethic of the Anthropocene. And that would be a very fun and imaginative exercise to engage in. Thanks.
I think I have the mic next. Hi.
Okay. Hey.
So I'm not going to talk very long. I have lots of questions. I empathize with a lot of what you say, but I want to comment in terms of the issue of ethics versus interest, because to a large extent, what we see currently, and I'm an earth scientist and I deal with the real world and its negative impacts on people. To a large extent, the issue of values and ethics and what we do with the environment is also influenced by interests. You know, we speak of the people who direct where we're doing and our response to the environment, the politicians and countries who have interests. And I'd like a comment in terms of how do you get those interests to reconcile with the ethics, the values that we have, that we would like to go in one direction, but our interests and the interests of the first world certainly is carrying us in a different direction. I'm from the Caribbean, so my interest is different. I'm interested in the environment being preserved, while the interest out there says the same thing, your value is the same thing, but the way in which you operate makes it difficult for us to do the very thing. So comment about ethics versus interest and how that influences our response.
Yeah, I'm always suspicious of dichotomies and bifurcations. And I think that's, in some ways, that's the epitome of Western logic, is that it's bimodal in a way. And so the first thing I am thinking is, I'm not sure those are all that separate from one another, that our interests are often informed by the ways that we value the world, the way that we value one another. So they're often informed by our ethics. They're also informed by, to go back to my talk and use another word, metaphysics, about our assumptions about what are we and what is the world and what is the relationship between those. And I think the way that maybe you get at that is by asking questions. So somebody's going on and on about interests. You say, wait a minute, like, tell me why those are your interests. And I don't think you'd have to get very many why questions down the road before you'd start seeing values and ethics come out. I don't know how you would escape that, actually. I'm just trying to think of that conversation. So pulling those things out, not allowing those to be separate. And I think the most obvious version is, if I'm acting in my own interests, I am evoking an ethic. It's called egocentrism. It has a name. So even just appealing to my own self-interest is a kind of ethic. It's not an ethic we're all terribly proud of, but it certainly is a kind of ethical appeal. So I think that's how I would go after it, is not let them bifurcate that way, hold them together. Thanks. Yeah.
We have 27 seconds left in this session, and we need to dedicate those seconds to another round of applause to our keynote speaker, Michael Nelson. And also to issue an apology, because I know there were far more hands than we had time for the questions, but Michael will be with us today. He's running a training session this afternoon, so I hope you will seek him out and continue to be in conversation with him. Thank you for your listening and your respect. Right now, we are going to take a 30-minute break. We will start promptly at 10:30 a.m. in this room. If you have a job or are seeking a job, you will join us in the Ponderosa room. There's coffee in there, so go straight into the Ponderosa room for the career Kickstarter. Otherwise, I hope you meet a new friend at this break. Thank you.